In this presentation, we're going to discuss the obstacles to the suppression and abolition of slave trade. We are going to look at it from two angles. We're going to look at the internal obstacles and as well the external obstacles. Internal obstacles simply means the obstacles that we are witness from within African continent. And also we have to look at the external obstacles, those of them that came from outside the African continent. In the history of the world and the history of Africa precisely, at the time in the history of the world and also the history of Africa precisely, over 10 million Africans were forcefully moved from Africa to Europe, the New World, Americas, and other parts of the world in what was known as the transatlantic slave trade. Well, it will be wrong for anybody, any speculator, any debater to put the blame of the success of the transatlantic slave trade only on the faces or on the head of Europeans, Americans, or from external point of view. No, it's to be wrong. There were internal collaborators, there were African collaborators, there were African dealers to this business. It was a two-way thing. The European dealers and African dealers coming together to make successful business. And unfortunately, it was the business or the business that had negative impact in Africa, which was simply the selling of Africans. So let's look at these two pointers and these two obstacles. Now let's look at the internal obstacles. The first obstacle that was witnessed was that a whole lot of empires and kingdoms in Africa were able to make a lot of money through the transatlantic slave trade. It was economically viable for most of them. A good number of them made money from the transatlantic slave trade and were finding it difficult to leave the business. One of such empire was the Oyo Empire. The Oyo Empire was very rich based on the outcome of the resources acquired through the transatlantic slave trade. We also have the Congo Kingdom. This and other kingdoms we are successful based on the transatlantic slave trade. And also the trade on slaves from Africa generally. Then some of these kingdoms and empires in Africa were able to get recruitment into their army through the slavery system. Most or some of the people they captured through slavery system were recruited into their army. So most of them found it difficult to let go of this business. Another pointer was that the economic purpose served by these slaves extended beyond the coffers of the states to individuals. There were a lot of individuals. There were some individuals in Africa at that period that became very wealthy based on their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and also the trading system or the trading chain generally. Most of them found it difficult to leave the business. They made some people in Africa made a whole lot of wealth through the transatlantic slave trade and were not ready to leave that business. The next one was that the next obstacle was that it was difficult to stop this trade in the sense that the projectors for the abolition of this slave trade could not bring alternative economic system. There was no alternative economic system in order to encourage Africans, Europeans to leave this business. This makes it very difficult. Another developer or pointer or point or factor was that in some areas in Africa, slaves were given the opportunity to grow to the point of freedom and also to create good situation for themselves. For instance, in the Niger Delta area of what is known today as Nigeria, their canoe house system or their house system gave slaves or people that were formerly slaves the opportunity to grow to a point of freedom and influence. This highly discouraged the abolition of the slave trade. An example, Jaja of Opobo of what was known as Bonny, Oko, Jumbo. These were former slaves of Igbo extraction that were able to regain their freedom or gain their freedom in the Niger Delta area and got to a point of even establishing their own settlement and creating a huge successful business platform in the Oyi River area. This system, even to a point, confused the British Council, precisely J.T. Hutchinson, who, after wandering for some years in Ethiopia, declared in 1861 that in many of the palm oil trading rivers, slavery was purely mythical. In Bonny, the men who ruled in political debate as well as the oil palm exchange are all slave class. Then another important point was that in the remote part of Africa, the issue of poor communication made it very difficult for Africans in the remote part to know that there was a move to abolish slave trade. This did not encourage the abolition of slave trade. Some Africans were not even aware that there was a move by Europeans led by the British and some other humanitarian organization to abolish slave trade. They continued engaging in it because the Europeans were still coming to buy and the dealers were also ready to do business with them. For instance, a particular king, that precisely the Obi of Abo, made it very clear that if the white men gave up buying of slaves, the black men will stop selling. By so doing, it requires two-way collaboration. But communication gaps or poor communication, or even absolute non-existing communication did not encourage. There was a communication gap. Africans could not speak European languages, and most of the Europeans could not even have access to the interior of Africa in order to stop the dealers from doing this business. Another pointer or another factor was that of Islamic practices. In Islam tend to encourage Muslims to enslave non-Muslims. While Islam forbids a Muslim to be enslaved by a fellow Muslim, it does not forbid a Muslim to enslave a non-Muslim. The fact that Islam allows slavery in this way describes the obstacle that the Atlantic slave trade faced. Thus, forcing the Eastern Sudanese to stop the trade, a means of their substance. So these are the internal obstacles against the abolition or suppression or extermination of the transatlantic slave trade. Let us look at the external obstacles. The first external obstacle there was that the Europeans were also making serious money, and we are not ready. The abolition in its making was to have serious impact on labor swell. They did not just open their arms openly and say, "Oh, let's abolish it." So the movement for the abolition of slave trade started in Europe, but paradoxically, it seems that opposition of the abolition of slave trade was stronger in Europe than in Africa. The extent of the opposition that came from Europe to the abolition is often underestimated because the abolition movement started there. Secondly, the naval attacks on slavers, which was the most effective means that made the abolition a reality, came from Europe. The Europeans who continued to buy slaves exported them to America to work in plantation. In this respect, the Industrial Revolution in Europe created a situation which partly discouraged slave trade and partly encouraged it. It discouraged it by demanding raw materials and market in Africa for manufactured goods. In other words, it offered substitutes for slave trade in Africa and for investment in Europe. But on the other hand, and to a great extent, many industrialized countries in Europe depended in American plantation for the supply of raw materials for their industries, and slaves were needed to work in the plantations. Well, the next point there was that though numerous and internal oppositions to abolition of slave trade were not deep rooted as external oppositions. Obi of Abo threw a light in the situation when he told the members of the 1941 expedition that formerly we thought it was God. It was God's wish that the white men should enslave the black men. If the white men give up buying slaves, the black men will stop selling. So it was a two-way thing. And the Europeans were also making huge economic benefit through it. The Africans who continued to trade in slave trade up to the second half of the 19th century did so fundamentally because there was a demand for slaves, and not because slaves formed the basis of the economy of the empires. The fact that Europeans were still demanding slaves also makes most of the dealers to continue getting involved in this. Another pointer of notice was that even in the British Parliament, there was high opposition. Although the British and humanitarian organizations led the abolition, but even in the British Parliament there was strong opposition. The effect of the opposition were felt in the fact that the motion of Wilberforce in the debate in favor of the abolition of slave trade was defeated in the British Parliament by 163 votes to 90 in 1790. In 1792, when the Danish government decided to abolish slave trade, another motion of Wilberforce was also defeated, 193 against 125 votes. Crow was the leading figure against the abolition of slave trade, and he stood in support of the continuous slave trading business. First, in Britain, if Britain abolished slave trade, another European country did not abolish. This is actually the words of Crow. He said that first, if Britain abolished slave trade, another European country did not abolish, this would weaken British Navy. Secondly, since slave trade formed the basis of the economy of West Indies would regard abolition of slave trade by Britain as an unfriendly act. Thirdly, also another projector to the slave trade business Pitt argued that the prosperity of West Indies was important to Britain and declared in 1778 that of the income derived from overseas and enjoyed in Britain, 80% came from the West Indies. So the Europeans were as well making money, strong money from their involvement in the slave trade business. The anti-abolition therefore looked at Wilberforce and his supporters as hypocrites who failed to see the social problem and distress in their fatherland but talked about evil in other lands. They felt that the distress of the European poor, the misery of the Irish peasants, and the condition of those engaged in coal and lead mining industries deserve more attention than the condition of the Negro slaves, which, as they argued, were better than their condition, and also which they argued were better than the condition of their own people at home. Two other factors in Europe hindered the progress of the work of the abolition movement. The slaves in West Indies revolted and killed many of their masters. Secondly, in 1793, France declared war on Europe. As a result, defense took predominant position over humanitarianism. This was the primary reason on which the British government based on its refusal to pass abolition bill before the cabinet of all the talents came to power. Another point was that deep-rooted opposition of the abolition of slave trade came from European nations rather than Britain. At the Congress of Vienna, 1815, France, Spain, and other European nations resisted yearnings as Castero's demand for the outright abolition of slave trade. Other European countries resisted the move by the British to abolish slave trade. Strong opposition foiled British efforts at the Congress of Verona in 1822. This could not bring a united front against the abolition of slave trade or in support of the abolition of slave trade. Moreover, between 1810 and 1815, Britain signed a number of treaties with other European nations who later failed to honor such treaties. Notwithstanding the agreements that the British had with other European countries, they failed to honor them because of what they were getting in all through the slave trade.